In this video, we are going to take a look at one of the most confusing and critical concepts of AngularJS called digest cycles or digest loops. In order to understand the inner workings of data binding or watchers in AngularJS, it is essential to understand on what exactly the digest cycle is. Furthermore, in order to work with $apply and $digest methods available in AngularJS, we still need to have a sound understanding on how digest cycle really works. In simple words, if you don't understand what exactly is a data cycle or say digest cycle inside AngularJS, you won't have a good understanding on how AngularJS really works. Being said that, let's jump in. And the first thing we need to understand about is the watch list. In my previous video, I already covered what exactly are watches. To wrap up, a watch is simply nothing but keeping track of a scope variable along with its values. So which means whenever you have some kind of data binding, for each of those particular data bindings you maintain in your markup, and if those data bindings are related to your scope objects or scope related variables, we are going to have the respective watches created as part of the AngularJS framework. So which means AngularJS framework maintains watches behind the scenes for each of the scope variables you use inside your data bindings. A bit more, all the watches together will be stored inside something called Watchlist. So this Watchlist again is nothing but a simple reference to all the list of watches maintained in the memory. So whenever I call Watchlist, which means it has got a group of watches which are essentially nothing but all those data bindings being monitored behind the scenes inside the Watchlist. So this watchlist is a memory variable inside the AngularJS context or AngularJS framework itself. Okay, so we did not really speak about watchlist at the scope level. In simple words, every particular scope is going to have its own watchlist associated with it. So which means if you have 2 or 3 scopes as part of your controllers or your templates or whatever, we are going to have the respective watchlist being maintained for each of those scopes individually. So if you have 3 scopes, you are going to have 3 watchlists because every scope is different. Even though they might be inheriting some properties from the other scopes, still every scope can be maintainable and independent based on whatever the criteria you might be mentioning in your programming. So every scope maintains its own watch list, and at the same time that particular watch list, whatever it is really bound to, is automatically maintained by AngularJS framework itself based on the data bindings you specify in your markup. Furthermore, there exists a watch list even at the root scope level. So no particular scope in general will not have a watch list. But again, a watch list will be created if and only if you have certain data bindings or you use your own watch listeners. If you do not have any kind of watch variables or watch listeners or anything, then you are not going to have watch lists at all. So even in your root scope, there might be possibilities like you might not have the watch list because sometimes you may not really have the variables or root scope based data bindings at all in your applications. But if there are, you are going to have the watch list even at the root scopes level as well. Now that we have some understanding about watches, watches lists, and at the same time the scopes associated with some kind of watch list, we need to jump into the concept called digest process. So digest cycle or digest process or digest loop is a huge topic in AngularJS. But let us start with very simple words. In general, what exactly is a digest process? So we know that a watch list usually contains a list of watches which will have all the scope variables and their respective values being tracked. Now, a digest process in simple words means a digest process is responsible to walk through the entire watch list for modifications. So which means, as I mentioned in my previous video, there will be AngularJS framework or AngularJS process which keeps track of all of these variables about their previous values and current values, and based on the modifications whatever the user might be making, these watches actually update the UI or say DOM. So there is a process which actually continuously monitors these watches and updates or informs the UI to update or render the DOM. So that process itself is nothing but digest process, and that digest process is responsible to walk through the list of all the watches available inside your watch list. Its only job is to just go through each and every watch available in the watch list and check whether a particular scope variable is dirty or not. So whenever I say dirty, whether it has changed from the previous value to any other new value. And that process is usually called as dirty checking. So which means digest process does a dirty checking against each and every watch. And as I mentioned, the process of checking the current values of the scope variables is with their previous values is nothing but dirty checking. As I mentioned, just watches for the variable values. Next, if digest process finds or figures out any kind of modifications were done to any of the watch variables, then it tries to execute any of the watch listeners which might be associated with the respective watches. Again, I already covered watch listeners in my previous video, so I do not want to explain much in this. So if you have any kind of watch listeners associated with any of the watches, then those watch listeners are going to be automatically executed the moment the digest process figures out or identifies that that respective watch variable has been modified or marked dirty. Next, it is the responsibility of the digest process to keep note of all the modifications which might be done to each of those watches available in the watch list and inform the AngularJS framework to update the DOM. That is important. So it is this process, the digest process itself, which takes care about all the modifications which have been done to the watches will be directly informed to AngularJS framework or the process inside the AngularJS framework which actually does update the DOM and finally gets rendered as part of the browser. And in general, the DOM gets updated only after the digest process. So which means this process has to complete first before even updating any of your DOM markup. So if you have the scope variables and if you happen to modify the scope variables related data, then before even the data binding or the updates using the data binding occurs to DOM, the digest process really gets executed behind the scenes. Once the digest process gets executed, once it has been done successfully, all of the respective watch listeners being executed if there exists any, and finally it informs all the modifications to the Angular process or say AngularJS framework to update the DOM, and then actually our DOM gets updated. This is one important topic, that is Angular context. We should be understanding that all of this actually gets executed as part of something called Angular context. In simple words, just consider Angular context is nothing but the runtime environment of AngularJS framework. So AngularJS framework, as you know, you are actually attaching the source of the AngularJS called some script tag, and you use angular.js or angularmin.js. So what happens is that whenever this AngularJS framework comes into the picture, just like jQuery runtime, it will have its own runtime, which means it instantiates all the Angular related objects, it does all the dependency injection, it loads all the necessary scripts and everything, and instantiates itself and keeps a complete memory and processes related to that particular memory independent of other JavaScript objects or other JavaScript frameworks, and that is exactly what we call it as Angular context. And all of this digest process along with watching list or watch variables, everything, all of this process will be actually carried inside the Angular context. So now that we have some understanding about digest process And that too in very simple words. We need to really go into the depth of this digest process on how it can really serve the Angular applications much better. So imagine I have a digest process which is having a watch list with 4 watch variables. And just imagine there are a couple of watch listeners associated to a couple of watches. So the first thing is that the digest process will be going through all of the watches available in the watch list, and it performs a dirty check. So which means it tries to figure out if the values have been modified behind the scenes. And if not, this is important, if no modifications, still it does a second round. This is very, very important. Whether or not it figures out any modifications which might be available previously, it still goes through the second cycle of the same digest process. So this is pretty important. Why it has to do that? Because a watch or a particular variable which might be modified by the watch might actually modify some other watch variable. So there is a probability of having multiple other scope variables or scope watches to be modified as part of the first cycle itself. So the digest process, while it is actually going through each of those watches and executing those watch listeners, there might be a possibility that during the execution or going through all of these watches, the variables of the same watches could have been modified by some other external source or as part of the watch listeners. So to keep track of all the modifications to the latest, it always does the second one. So this is pretty important. For every digest process, we are going to have at least 2 minimum iterations to be always performed. And again, not just 2, you can only have a maximum of 10 iterations. And if your digest process cannot stop for 10 iterations as such, it is going to throw an error. So this is in overall, like every particular digest process, whenever it does the performing of the watches, the list or going through the list of all the watches, it does at least twice. Okay. Next, let us see how the digest cycle really works whenever there exists any updates with respect to the scope variables. So imagine I have first level watch updates, and at the same time how the digest cycle really works at the first level. So I have the watch B, and B value has been changed to 3. So my controller or some other ng-click event or whatever the event might have been modifying my value of variable B to something new called 3. And now the digest process is going to kick in, and it is going to it is going through each of those particular watches. Then it figures out, oh, there is a particular new watch variable here, or a new value being associated to that particular watch. So that needs to be informed to AngularJS framework in order to update UI. So it keeps track of that notification, so which means it notes down the modification of this update to the scope variable called B. Once noted, it will be normal. And now it does the second iteration again. So once it keeps note of all the modifications of all the watch variables as part of its first iteration, it just goes to the second iteration and checks for any other new modifications. If there aren't any, then finally it goes back to updating of DOM by informing all the nodes on what are all the modifications it found as part of its parsing process or going through process. So this is pretty important. Next, let us see if the watch listener itself is modifying some other variable. So that is the second case. So we call that one a second level watch updates, and how it performs as part of digest cycle. So the same story. In this case, I'm having something different. Instead of variable B, I'm actually having variable C. So which means C has been modified to 7. But I just wanted to explain, like the watcher for the C has got a watch listener, and that watch listener is actually updating the scope variable A to 10 whenever the watch listener is going to be executed. So this is very important. So the watch listener is not going to be executed automatically. It will be executed only by the digest process. So which means whenever you update the value of C to something new value, you cannot expect the watch listener to kick in immediately. That will be executed by the digest process. So how it does execute? Simple. Whenever the digest process kicks in, it actually goes through every variable or every watcher inside the watch list, goes through A, B, and C. Now it found C has been modified. Then it executes watch listener, which in turn executed A to 10. And okay, now it understood the value C has been modified to C, but it did not note anything about A. It might be just having only only noted the value of C to 7. Now it goes back. Okay, C has been modified 7. I keep a note of it, but it doesn't know about A yet. So now it does the second iteration. Now during the second iteration, it goes through all the watches again, and now it found, oh, there is one more new thing available there, so I need to keep note of this one too. So now it keeps a note of this one too and execute for the third time. So if there are no modifications in the third time, then finally it is going to update the DOM. So this is one of the situations where I might be having more than 2 iterations, but again, it is not fair to say it is always going to be 3 or 4, but a maximum of 10 is allowed. But beyond 10, AngularJS might think you are really running into some infinite loop or something, and it might throw an error. So that is pretty important. So the second level or the third levels are usually performed whenever you are having some modifications being performed as part of your digest process iterations themselves. Okay, let us have a quick demo on how these watches and even the digest cycles to be actually seen in a practical way. So, okay, I have a very simple HTML here where I have variable A provided in the form of a text box, and it is going to be data bound here. Similarly, variable B having a data binding, two-way data binding and one-way data binding here. Similarly, C. So all of these 3 variables are actually associated with scope A and B and C respectively with values 1, 2, 3. So now I just refresh this, and now you can see I actually have 1, 2, 3. So if I modify A value to 10, you are going to see automatically those values are being updated by AngularJS frameworks through data binding. And we need to understand on how this data binding is performing behind the scenes and how this digest process is really going to be kicking in. Okay, for our understanding, let us add a couple of scope watches. So I am going to watch. By the way, if you are not familiar with $watch or watch, please go through my previous video. So this is my watch for variable A, and I am going to test if new value is not equal to old value. Then I am going to display a message to the console saying that A got modified to a new value. Okay, so similarly I am going to have even for B and even for C. So let me go to B and let me go to C. So this needs to be B, this needs to be C. So I added 3 watchers, and each of those watchers are actually watching their own variables A, B and C respectively. So I need to modify this one to C. Sorry, this needs to be C as well. Okay, so let me refresh, and you can see the console. Right now nothing, but the moment I modify a value to 10, you can see my watcher is getting executed for those modifications, whatever I'm trying to do from the data binding perspective. Okay, so let me clear this. So now that we added a couple of watches, we know when A is getting modified and when B is, and similarly when C is. So now I'm going to have a new watcher to be added to the root scope. And by the way, I'm using root scope here because I already imported root scope in the form of dependency injection there. So I'm going to watch, and in this case I'm not watching any variable. So if you do not have any variable, then AngularJS is smart enough to actually execute your callback function whenever your particular digest cycle is going to be executed. So this function is going to be executed for every iteration of your digest cycle. So in this case, I just wanted to say something like console.log digest iteration started, something like this. Okay, let me see. So I just refresh this, and you can see the digest iteration has been started and it actually completed twice. So as I mentioned, whenever the digest process kicks in, it executes at least 2 times, and that is the reason I got 2 comments there. So let me clear. Now I modify the variable A to 10, and now this is important. Now you see I have the first digest cycle executed, and while it is executing, it found that the variable A has been modified, and then it has executed the watcher of A, which actually printed this message. And then again, after executing the watcher, it has done the second iteration of the same digest process. So you can see our digest process has been executed twice, and after the first iteration, the watcher is being executed. So now it is confirmed that the watches are going to be executed only by the digest processes. Okay, so let me clear everything, and I go to 10, and you can see, okay, let me clear everything again. Let me clear this one too. So I modify this one to 10. You can see A has been modified. I cleared everything, and now I go to B. Now you can see even for B it is actually doing twice. Let me clear, and even for C, and you can see it has done twice. Okay, so similarly I go to this, and any number of times you modify, it is going to do all the respective watcher related messages, and it is going to kick in your digest processes and based on the modifications you do. So now that we understood this process, we need to even test this process as well, where I am going to have my own watch listener which actually updates the value of A to something new. So for that, I just wanted to be a bit more creative here, saying that if $scope.c value, whenever it is greater than 50, I would like to have the scope value of A to be modified to something like 1000. So let us see how this is going to work for us. So what I'm saying is, if the value of C gets changed by the user to something new, it checks whether the value is greater than 50. If so, I am actually modifying scope A, which means it is supposed to kick in this guy whenever A has been modified. So let me save this and refresh this. Okay, so let me clear this, and now I modify C value to 30, and you can see nothing has really been performed here, as because the value of C is still less than 50, no modifications. So let me clear everything, and now I go with 300. So this is where the interesting thing happens. First time, you can see the first iteration goes through and it understood C has been modified, so our watcher has been executed, and as part of that watcher we actually updated the value of A. Now the second iteration is being performed, then it has understood, oh, the value of A has been changed, so let me execute the watcher of A, which in turn showed the message A has been modified. And further, the third iteration has been performed, and as there are no other more modifications, then the digest cycles ended right there. So in that way you can see that, even though you might be having 1 or 2 iterations at the very beginning, it might really go beyond 2 or 3 based on the structure of your programming, how you are trying to accomplish. But again, it is always recommended to minimize the digest cycles as less as possible, or as to the minimum as possible, as because it will have tremendous effect on the performance with respect to your AngularJS applications. Okay, now let us jump to the next one. So we are done with demo. So the next topic is same digest process or digest cycle, but how it is really related to the scope. So till now we haven't figured out what exactly is scope and on how it is really going to work with digest process. So I already mentioned every particular scope will have its own association to Watchlist. And the digest process is not just for the Watchlist. The digest process is actually available at further higher level beyond the scope or beyond the Watchlist. That is, there will be only one digest process which actually goes through all of the watchlists available and what are all the watchlists associated with the respective scopes as well. So you can see during the first iteration, the digest process goes through the first root scope related watch list. And if it doesn't find any modifications, it tries to find any other scopes or child scopes available and tries to figure out if there exists any watch list related to those scopes and goes through those watch lists available there. So in that way, the digest process always kicks in or starts at root scope level, and further it will be identifying all the scopes nested as part of the root scope or nested further into the existing scopes, goes through each of those watches list and figures out if there exists any changes, and if there are any changes it actually jumps to the further successive iterations of the digest process. So in this case, as I mentioned, there will be at least 2 digest process cycles. It is going to execute twice as part of this, and finally the UI or updating of DOM happens. So there is one important topic here. There are only 2 points. The digest process always starts at the root scope. And if the digest process figures out that a watch list has got certain modifications, or it is figured out like this watch list is dirty, then it actually skips from this watch list and goes to the secondary iteration automatically. Okay, this is pretty much about the digest process and how it is really related to the scope and where this digest process really sits whenever it is trying to execute all the watch lists available. Okay, now this is the last slide. That is a complete picture on how this digest process is really going to be working behind the scenes as part of AngularJS. Now we know that digest process is always going to be executed as part of the Angular context, and digest process will be always going through all the watch lists, and it actually goes through at least twice. So this is what we have already covered in my previous slides. There's no difference still here. And of course this is straightforward. The Angular context is always going to be running within the JavaScript or your JavaScript runtime. So if there is no JavaScript, there is no Angular context at all. So as part of the JavaScript runtime, we are going to have the Angular context runtime, or say AngularJS runtime. So Angular context will be always working hand in hand with the JavaScript. So all your JavaScript code might be available here. All your jQuery code or JavaScript code might be available in this gray area. But if it is something related to the Angular, it will be actually executed as part of the Angular context. So this is important. So prior to even getting this, there is one thing we need to understand. Who is going to kick in the digest process to execute or to go through all the watch lists? So there should be something which actually says like, okay, digest process, now you go through the watch list. Please start your job. So who is saying that command to the digest process in order to go through all the watch lists? It is not automatic or it is not configurable. It is automatic in certain ways. However, there is no frequency or a particular interval on how the digest process will be kicking in. There is no continuous intervals, there are no poles, nothing. And that digest process will be always kicking in based on the events which happen as part of your application. And those events could be any DOM events, like if you actually provide ngClick or something, those DOM events can actually kick digest process. So if you happen to have your ngClick written, you should understand after the ngClick execution, it is going to have the digest process to be automatically kicked in. Whether you know or not, this process gets executed behind the scenes whenever ngClick gets executed. Similarly, whenever you perform any AJAX operations using $HTTP and if you have any callbacks, yes, the digest processes will be kicking in. So that is the reason you will see, like after the AJAX calling or your ngClick or DOM events, the data bindings are automatically going to happen because this digest process is going to be kicked in for almost all of these events available, including DOM events, AJAX events, and if you are using $timeout with a callback, and if your browser location actually gets changed, or if you use $apply or $digest as part of your application. I'm going to cover $apply and $digest in my upcoming video, but just for your understanding, if your code uses any of these, you are going to have this digest process to be automatically kicked in. And I just mentioned only 5 here, but there might be a couple more instances. But other than these instances, usually you will never have the digest process to be automatically kicked in. So this is pretty important. And of course, even for the data bindings and so on, it is going to have the digest process to be kicked in. But there is no particular interval which actually says, okay, it is time now, let's do the digest process. That's not going to happen. Okay, now that we understood like when this digest process is going to be kicked in, we need to understand about how the browser really works with our application too. As you know, browser is the main responsible person to actually render your DOM. So if there is no browser, your DOM is not going to render or will not be rendered. So your DOM gets rendered, and that is the process which will be carried, or it is the responsibility of the browser itself. And again, browser is going to have its own events, like the DOM events, like onClick. It might have its own timer events, like using setTimeout and so on. And you can see I'm using $timeout, so which means this is related to AngularJS. $apply, AngularJS. $HTTP, AngularJS. But these are different. These are related to the browser or say your JavaScript kind of a deal. So the browser can have your onClick events, or based on the timer or the intervals you set up as part of your JavaScript, the browser is going to kick in all of those events, and you call all of these events to be performed in the form of an event queue. So the browser maintains an event queue of all of your events and executes them one by one, and it maintains the message queue and an event loop right here. And there is one important thing. There is no relation between this event queue and these events which actually kick in the digest process. So that is one of the most confusing things where the developers will try to understand. So if you happen to handle these DOM events in your own JavaScript or jQuery without using ngClick, this process is not going to be kicking in. That is very important. So imagine I am writing jQuery $sign using a button .onClick do something. Yes, it does. Even if you modify the scope variables, yes, it does. However, this digest process is not going to be kicking in. This process is going to be kicking in if and only if it falls into the category of these. So if you are writing your jQuery events or DOM related events, it is your job to actually invoke the digest process manually by using $apply or $digest, which we are going to cover in the next session anyway. But we got some understanding, like the browser is responsible for DOM rendering processes and accepting all the events from the user, including clicks or timer events or whatever it does, and those events will be actually further transmitted or sent to our JavaScript, and our JavaScript further, based on your programming model, it will be invoking the respective events of the Angular. And you can see all of these will be acting as a bridge between your JavaScript runtime and the Angular runtime, or Angular context in this case. So if you do not have these bridges, Angular context will have no idea about what are all the changes happening in the JavaScript or browser, and it will never kick this process. So Angular context solely depends on these bridges, and with these bridges are supposed to be automatically called based on how you have configured using ngclick or $http, whatever you might be writing as part of your JavaScript and so on. And whenever these bridges receive the respective events or the callbacks, it is going to inform the Angular context that this digest process needs to be kicked in, and once the digest process completes its job, it informs the DOM that there are some modifications which need to be rendered, and that process will be carried out by the browser. And once the rendering process has been done, the browser will be still waiting for the user for more and more events. And once again the user clicks on something, or if the timer actually times out, or if any interval carries, again this process goes on. So this is what we will be calling it as event loop, together with how the Angular context related digest cycle loops work. So this is the digest loop and this is the event loop. So those two loops will be working hand in hand based on your particular application development, whatever you might be doing, including jQuery or other frameworks. All of the other frameworks will be sitting inside the JavaScript area, and those are completely independent of Angular context. And if you need to kick in digest process or whatever, those outside JavaScript frameworks need to go through these bridges and finally ask the digest process to automatically kick in by itself. So this is a complete picture about how the digest process or digest loop, whatever you call it as, really works behind AngularJS.